Question 86 of the Summa Theologia is what our intellect knows in material things. Now, first of all, to define a material thing, which you probably know already, it's something that has matter, like this lizard right there, that is a material thing, unlike something like an angel or a God. The Blessed Trinity is immaterial. Concepts like justice or love or freedom, those are not material things. Those are abstract, ideas or concepts or things like that. So what he's interested in knowing about here is how does our mind, being immaterial itself, come to know material things in the world? And there is a relatively brief question. There's only 4 articles, so this will go by pretty quickly. And Article 1 says whether our intellect knows singulars. Now, a singular as opposed to, I guess you could say, multiples. This is one singular grasshopper there, one individual, matter, soul, composite, sensitive soul and matter comes together to create this composite of a grasshopper. But it's one singular grasshopper. It's not a universal grasshopperness. It's just the one. And this corpus is kind of short. So Thomas says, our intellect cannot know the singular in material things directly and primarily. So this creates an interesting conundrum because our intellect can't know that individual grasshopper per se, because the reason of this is that the principle of singularity in material things is individual matter, whereas our intellect understands by abstracting the intelligible species from such matter. So we look at this grasshopper and we have a phantasm or an idea, something. And again, like I did the last video, so now we're looking at the lizard. You're no longer looking at the grasshopper, but you still remember what the grasshopper looks like, right? So that's the phantasm. That's the image in your mind, the similitude, I guess you could say, of that grasshopper, which I'll show you again. Now you have a phantasm of the lizard in your mind, right, of what it looks like. But you also are able to universalize that. So you can look at the senses will see this grasshopper, but the intellect will know the universal of what that grasshopper has to do with every other grasshopper that has ever jumped around in the world. And that's got to be in the billions and billions and billions of them, because they all have the same nature. And basically, essentially, they're the same, even though these are individual ones that we're looking at here. That's an individual grasshopper, right? Okay, now what is abstracted from individual matter is the universal. Hence, our intellect knows directly the universal only. But indirectly, and as it were, by a kind of reflection, it can know the singular. Now, this is where it gets very interesting, because the intellect is associated with the universal of grasshopperness, but in some way it can also come to know the individual. Okay, it can know that individual grasshopper because the senses have relayed that information, because the phantasm here is of this kind of yellowish grasshopper. It's not green or brown or blue. It's this one. It's this particular grasshopper, right? Even after abstracting the intelligible species, the intellect, in order to understand, needs to turn to the phantasm in which it understands the species. Okay, therefore, it understands the universal directly through the intelligible species, and indirectly the singular represented by the phantasm, and thus it forms the proposition Socrates is a man, right? So Socrates is an individual and man is a universal. So Socrates is an individual within the universal of mankind, right? And of course, this is the treatise on man. We're learning a lot about human nature in these articles. Article 2, whether our intellect can know the infinite. He says, now remember, we're talking about matter. And when you hear the word infinite, you should remember that that's one of the 7 attributes of God. God is infinite. In fact, he's the only being that is infinite. He's everywhere, right? He is everywhere through his power. And it says Thomas says, in material things, the infinite does not exist actually, but only potentially in the sense of one thing succeeding another. So we can imagine an infinite number of grasshoppers, right? They just keep on going and going and going, right? Therefore, infinity is potentially in our mind through its considering successively one thing after another, because never does our intellect understand so many things that it cannot understand more. Isn't that true? On the other hand, our intellect cannot understand the infinite either actually or habitually. Now, not actually, for our intellect cannot know actually at the same time except what it knows through one species. We talked about that last video yesterday, where we can know a species in our mind that we're thinking about at the moment, but then we can move to another species or another particular topic, but we're discursive. We're always going from one thing to the next. But the infinite is not represented by one species, for if it were, it would be something whole and complete. Consequently, it cannot be understood except by a successive consideration of one part after another, as is clear from its definition. So I think that's enough. There's more there, but I think you get the idea. Whether our intellect can know contingent things. Now, this picture there shows contingency means, different options, different choices that can be made. That's what is the principle of our free will, is that we're not directed to one particular action, but we do have contingency in us as human beings. He says here, contingent things can be considered in two ways, either as contingent or as containing some element of necessity. Since every contingent thing has in it something necessary, this is a little confusing to me, I'll be honest, but the next paragraph will clear it up a little bit, hopefully, right? For example, that Socrates runs is in itself contingent, because he could not be running, right? He's either running or he's not running, but that's contingent. But the relation of running to motion is necessary, for it is necessary that Socrates moves if he runs. Okay. Now, contingency arises from matter, for contingency is a potentiality to be or not to be, and potentiality belongs to matter. Now, matter is in the individual. Matter is particular, like that grasshopper I showed you a few minutes ago. It had particular matter. It wasn't the matter of the whole species or nature. It was that particular grasshopper had that matter, right? Whereas necessity results from form, because whatever is consequent on form is of necessity in the subject. But matter is the individualizing principle, whereas the universal comes from the abstraction of the form from the particular matter. So, anyways, a little confusing, but okay, he says the intellect of itself and directly has the universal for its object, which we've already learned, while the object of senses is the singular, which in a certain way is the indirect object of the intellect. Therefore, the contingent, considered as such, is known directly by sense and indirectly by the intellect, while the universal and necessary principles of contingent things are known only by the intellect. This is the kind of article that when I do this again, which I plan on doing, once we get through the whole Summa, I'm just going to start over and just do it again, right? It's going to make more sense. Most of what I don't understand is not because Thomas isn't explaining it well enough. It's because I haven't grasped all of these concepts yet, and maybe you have. But again, this is all going to make more sense as we go through it. The last article is whether our intellect can know the future. He says we apply the same distinction to future things as we applied above to contingent things. Okay, the last article, that was so confusing. For future things considered as subject to time are singular, and the human intellect knows them by reflection only, as stated above. But the principles of future things may be universal, and thus they may enter the domain of the intellect and become the objects of science. Now, notice he's talking about particulars and universals, matter, form. This runs through the entire Summa. This is why, to this day, we have this thing called the problem of universals, the problem of realism, the problem of, do real things exist outside of the physical things that we see? And this is a very, very fundamental question and debate within philosophy. Speaking, however, of the knowledge of the future in a general way, we must observe that the future may be known in two ways, either in itself or in its cause. The future cannot be known in itself save by God alone, for whomever that is present, to whomever even that is present, which is the course of events, is future, for as much as from eternity his glance embraces the whole course of time. Okay, I bumbled that a little bit, but God sees everything in one glance, past, present, future, what we call, it's all in one glance. It's an eternal now with God, right? And he's the only being that is able to do that. Angels can't, we can't. We don't know the future like God knows the future, right? Okay, but for as much as it exists in its cause, the future can be known to us also. And if indeed the cause be such as to have a necessary connection with a future result, then the future is known with scientific certitude. Will the sun rise tomorrow? Yes. Why? Because it's been rising for the last, millennia of years. And so we have scientific certitude that it's going to rise. Do I know the future? Yeah, in that regard, I do. Just as the astronomer foresees the future eclipse. If, however, the cause be such as to produce a certain result more frequently than not, then can the future be known more or less conjecturally, according as its cause is more or less inclined to produce the effect. I live in Texas. Will next June be hot in Texas? Yes. Why? Because it always seems to be that way. Okay, so conjecturally, I think that it's probably going to be hot next June in Texas. Do I know the future? In a way, yes. Do I know what you're going to have for lunch tomorrow? No. Unless I knew you and knew that every single lunch for the last 20 years you've had a ham sandwich, then I would say you're going to have a ham sandwich for lunch tomorrow. That's going to do it for question 86. Hope you enjoyed that, of what our intellect knows in material things. And tomorrow we're going to move on to question 87. You can conjecturally predict that because I've been pretty consistent with doing a video a day for 86 days, so you can probably know the future in that regard, that I'm going to have question 87 tomorrow. Okay, see how this works? Thanks for watching. Hope you enjoy studying the Summa one question at a time. St. Thomas Aquinas, pray for us. God bless you.